Welcome everybody to the British Foreign Policy Group. My name is Sophia Gaston and I'm the director here. Today we're here to speak about disinformation and the role that it's playing in the coronavirus landscape. We are hugely privileged to be joined by two of the leading thinkers and practitioners in this space. Nina Jankowicz works at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., where she studies the intersection of democracy and technology in Central and Eastern Europe. Her book, How to Lose the Disinformation War, will be published in July. Welcome, Nina. And Peter Pomerantsev, he's a writer, a journalist. He's written two very important books, the most recent of which is called This Is Not Propaganda. Peter's my colleague at the LSE and the founder of our research unit, ARENA, where he leads our studies into the intersection between disinformation and polarization and populism. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's jump straight in. Nina, talk to us about the disinformation landscape in the pandemic. How is it how would you characterize the ecosystem? Are you seeing it sort of feed into other different kind of disinformation narratives? Or is there something really unique about health disinformation and the way in which that's playing out? And something that I particularly want to touch on is the sort of outsized role that China seems to be playing in this. And I'm wondering whether you think this might be a sort of wake-up call for people starting to cotton on to the idea of China being an active player in the disinformation space.
So I think the uniting thing about this pandemic and the infodemic, as the World Health Organization called it, is the fact that there is just so much emotion, so much uncertainty that all sorts of disinformation is feeding off of. The best disinformation, as we know, is grounded in a kernel of emotional, visceral truth. It's not necessarily something that is completely made up, completely fake, some fake website on the, in the cobwebbed corners of the internet. It's stuff that people can really identify with. And right now there's just so much of that emotion going around that we have not only foreign actors like Russia and China feeding off of that, but we've got domestic actors who are trying to score political points. And we've got, your garden variety hucksters and snake oil salesmen who are trying to make a quick buck. So it's a really, really dangerous information environment. I think what is different about it in terms of the foreign disinformation that I look at, and I focus mostly on disinformation coming from Russia, is that I think the audience is shifting a little bit rather than just focusing on audiences in the West. There's a lot of elements of this disinformation that's meant actually for Russians at home, that I think, the stuff that happened in 2016 during our election, or even some of the domestic disinformation we've seen proliferating in Central and Eastern Europe, was clearly to cause chaos, to undermine democratic systems there. But there's a lot that's happening right now that's propping up Putin. I'm thinking in particular of the mask diplomacy, when the Kremlin sent us a large plane full of PPE and ventilators, some of which we could not use, but it was this kind of grand trolling moment where, the United States, which was asked to leave Russia in 2012 with the United States Agency of International Development, was now receiving aid from the Kremlin, which we then had to pay for, which I find very hilarious on many levels. So we have a bit of that. Of course, that was playing, on all of the state TV networks in Russia for several weeks afterward. And China, of course, is engaging in some of that mask diplomacy as well, in addition to, trying to cover up the role that it played in the spread of the virus, which I think is to be expected. But again, the most important thing for me to drive home to any audience is that it's the emotion that disinformation runs on that makes it so successful. And we need to kind of put a barrier between ourselves and that. So when we find ourselves getting really agitated or angry at an article or piece of information that we see on Twitter or whatever social media platform you're using, the best thing to do is put your device down and walk away, practice some informational distancing, and consider the source, consider why they might have an interest in manipulating you. And then if you find yourself still still thinking about it, to look toward the experts, not politicians and pundits, but scientists and doctors, in order to really get that trustworthy information at that time. Of course, we've got a lot of hucksters who are claiming themselves to be coronavirus experts right now as well. But again, distance and time is going to allow us to take this information environment piece by piece and a little bit more slowly than we might otherwise.
Thanks, Nina. So, Peter, just picking up on this point about how Russia is involving itself in the pandemic. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are almost surprised that Russia feels a little bit absent from the kind of the world stage. There is a lot of focus on China and their sort of propaganda campaigns. How can you shine some light on how this pandemic is playing out in Russia? And also at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, how would someone like Putin and his GRU, how would they look at this coming onslaught of the pandemic and think we can opportunistically harness this for our own strategic gains?
Well, so, you know, Russian media and information operations, as Nina sort of alluded to, have different kind of theaters and different arenas that they play into. And what we have seen, for example, are sort of very worrying things happening inside Ukraine, for example, which is one theater where the Kremlin has very specific aims to divide the country, undermine the leadership, alienate it from the West. And we also saw some very disturbing scenes in Ukraine of sort of small riots around the pandemic based on disinformation around the pandemic. And it's difficult to understand who's behind those. So those are like, you know, there we're talking about, you know, what we are now used to as kind of Russian subversive psyops, basically, to disrupt and achieve its foreign policy goals. Overall, however, I think I'm not sure the Kremlin has an obvious bone in this fight. You know what I mean? This is not this is not like so many other campaigns that's been involved in where you can clearly see what its aims are. Quite the opposite. They've been trying to play nice. They've been doing kind of more kind of soft power, you know, sending aid to Europe. There's clearly some sort of back channel happening, trying to use this as an opportunity to take sanctions away from Russia. So I don't know, compared to these kind of concerted campaigns that we've seen around, you know, various elections or support for right-wing movements, what we're seeing so far, and the data's still coming in, by the way, we don't know. What we've seen so far is Russia, by its standards, in the international arena, I think kind of maybe waiting to see what are the gains, because I think that the most obvious gains are actually ones about playing nice, because, you know, they've been trying to get rid of sanctions for a while. So that's my first thing. I mean, if I was to be looking for something interesting in Russian, and I had amazing digital analytical tools, you know, at my beck and call, then I would maybe be thinking about, is Russia trying to climb into American and Chinese accounts to get America and China to fight more in order to push its agenda that President Macron has already advocated, that Russia will be an ally with the West against our new great enemy, the Chinese. So if I was Russia, I'd be doing that. But, you know, the data's only coming in. It always takes quite a long time for us to really get a full picture of things. Plus, attribution has become incredibly hard in the new landscape of encryption. So a lot of stuff is happening on closed WhatsApp groups, not on Twitter. And, you know, increasingly what we see throughout the world is Russia working through local marketing companies. So in Africa, they don't just hire local marketing companies to do campaigns. It's not a troll sitting in St. Petersburg. That makes it much, much harder to attribute and track, because they're literally working with local or international partners.
So, Nina, I just want to step back and think about the kind of the nature of this pandemic and how it lends itself to disinformation, but also to misinformation. And I think it's always important to make that distinction between what we're talking about here and that sort of degree of intent to deceive. This is a pandemic which is itself, you know, to use that sort of Rumsfeldian term, is one of unknown unknowns. We're learning about the disease itself. We're learning about how to respond to the disease, you know, in terms of governance and in terms of health and in terms of, you know, all of these impacts on our society and our very connected world. So there's a huge degree of uncertainty about it. And surely that must create an environment that is more prone to both mis and disinformation. And I presume the actors involved in promoting disinformation are aware of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. Again, as I said earlier, this is just a huge opportunity for anyone who wants to sow any sort of malign narrative. Again, whether that's peddling a fake cure or supporting a certain politician. So to look at a case study that I kind of dove into in the past couple of weeks, in 2018, I discovered this network of astroturfing accounts that was trying to run a campaign against Elizabeth Warren. This guy was running for Senate. And someone had reached out to me who was kind of, I guess, abused by these accounts. She was a part of the GOP, super Trump supporter, and she had put me on her mailing list way back in 2018. I never took myself off because I find it kind of interesting to look at the rhetoric that they're using. And during the coronavirus pandemic, she went from being kind of, you know, Trump supporter, fairly rabid Trump supporter, to absolutely devolving into this sphere of dis and misinformation. She wasn't creating disinformation, she was a conduit of it, and certainly buying into it. And then again, in some cases, sharing what I would call misinformation, trying to inform people. There was no malign intent behind it, but she was sharing things that were actually quite dangerous, including organizing a rally to liberate her state of Massachusetts from the unjust lockdown. And I think the thing that united all of the narratives that she was sharing wasn't necessarily, you know, any sort of malice or, again, malign intent. It was actually that she wanted to kind of organize on behalf of Trump and excuse Trump and the Trump administration's mistakes that have been going on for the past 2 months here, 3 months even, in the United States. So sometimes the narratives were even contradictory that she was sharing. But again, it was toward that one goal. And so I think we're seeing just the loss of analytical thinking in service of whatever it might be, whether that, again, is folks who are trying to make money or folks who are trying to serve some sort of bigger political goal. And in the end, it's really endangering people, which is what's extremely scary. This woman doesn't have, you know, a huge following on Twitter. She's actually a local radio host. She has this newsletter that she sends out. So how do you counter that sort of narrative when actually what she's doing is gathering people in real life, and then there are counter protesters there. She's yelling in their faces without a mask. I mean, it just goes to show that we're not only talking about foreign actors, and in fact, that's something that I think really needs to be driven home. The domestic disinformation that we are seeing in this pandemic, and it's happening to some degree in every single country, is a lot more dangerous than the foreign stuff that is kind of just glomming onto these narratives that already exist. Certainly the disinformation that's coming from, for instance, the White House is certainly more dangerous than some of these kind of fringe narratives that are getting amplified because they are coming from quote unquote Russian or Chinese sources. So that's the sort of stuff I'm thinking about. And it's because there is that informational vacuum about the coronavirus, people are looking for and channeling these sources of you know, malign narratives into one stream.
Peter, I'm thinking about you know, something that we always talk about at Arena is looking at this like intersection between the sort of often the external actors trying, as Nina just talked about, to sort of like seize upon and graft upon domestic, social and political unrest and tensions and so on. How do you see us moving forward beyond this when you've had governments intervening and saying it is unacceptable to have the spread of conspiracy theories and this kind of degree of misinformation or disinformation in the pandemic? You know, we already had this kind of political disinformation, the rise of this in a lot of our advanced liberal democracies. How do you see governments kind of reconciling with this and that social responsibility on the other side, and perhaps platforms as well?
So I think that there's 3 questions you just asked. Which one do you want me to tackle the most? Platform responsibility is fascinating in this crisis. Huh?
As ever, I trust that you will skillfully navigate through my compound questions. I trust you.
Okay, let me try. I think there's just I think following on from what Nina said, which relates part of your question. I'll get on to the other parts, which is, so without a doubt, you have an environment where, you know, a lot of actors are working very hard, whether for commercial or political gain, to use this crisis and for various mis and disinformation aims. What I'm very interested in, there's always two sides though to this information game. One is the supply side, which is, you know, how much stuff is being pumped out there, and the one, to use a very crude economic metaphor, is the demand side. And I don't know about America. America might be different for a bunch of reasons we can explore, but in Europe, and here I still include Britain, actually we've seen, I think, a coming together during this crisis. So if before we had this very strong polarization in Britain around Brexit and Remain, in Europe with glowing populist movements, there seems to be a moment, and it might not be just be a moment, where actually the majority of people, looking at the data we have so far, are actually inside one reality bubble. Yeah, so I think there's some stuff coming out from King's College London, but again, this might be misinformation, so be careful, double check it. But I think 90% of people agreed with the lockdown. So it's not falling, and the 10% who don't agree are just the fringes, you know, the really, really right-wing libertarian types and the really left-wing ones, both of whom don't trust government and anything they say. So actually, I think we're seeing it coming together, because we do have to remember that kind of like misinformation, disinformation both augments but feeds onto polarization. You know, there's much larger trends going on, and really when we talk about fighting these things, that's the issues that we have to address, because that's where this sort of like the disinformation, misinformation, you know, that's the ground it rains down on and sprouts various political distortions. So actually, I think we're seeing, I mean, in Italy, Salvini has suddenly gone a little bit quiet for Salvini. In Germany, AfD quieter. I mean, if anything, everywhere we're seeing a consolidation around authority, about epistemic authority, around listening to the scientists, following them. You know, we see them every day. It's a much more fact-driven and evidence-driven conversation, full stop. So actually, this is a really good moment in the sense of, you know, the old engines of trust. America might be seeing a different sort of a different tendency, but I'd love to see some data. How many people are actually, you know, out there wanting to end the lockdown? They're very loud, they capture a lot of attention, but how many is that? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, America is entering an election year where everything is going to get partisan, you know, to the limit. So it'd be interesting to see whether that trend continues in America. But here, I'm interested to see how long this kind of coming together around one common shared reality will last. I know you've written very powerfully saying it won't last. It's going to get a lot worse. It's going to exacerbate divides. Maybe there's definitely, you know, I understand why one might think that. So that's the underlying social dynamic that's happening. I suppose with that, you have something from the platforms, or the platforms and governments, after being at loggerheads, and really they're in the middle of this big fat fight about how to regulate the internet, coming together saying, you know, the one thing we can agree on is that it's okay to regulate disinformation which is connected to public health. That's the one bit of free speech where everybody says, meh, free speech kind of takes a holiday when it comes to posts saying you should drink silver or bleach, for example, to stop the coronavirus. So we see them coming together. I think it's a moment where I think what's really going on is the platforms are trying to prove to governments, look, we can police our own platforms. You know, when push comes to shove, when there's a national crisis, we will take harmful content down. We can do it ourselves. Therefore, you don't need to regulate us, because both Europe and the UK are on the verge of very serious regulations with serious penalties for platforms if they don't police properly, and most importantly with the regulators that would enforce that. So I think this has been like one big push from the companies saying, look how we can clean up our act. You can trust us. So I think that's what's going on in that space. So I answered two of your questions. I think I should, you know, let Nina come in now.
Do you want me to keep going on that one? I mean, I could talk about the platforms. I think you're exactly right, Peter, that this has been more than anything a PR push. It shows what they can do when they have political will, but I'm not sure that the response is really that what we would want in a democratic country in some regards. There was an example after these Liberate protests took off and started to kind of multiply. There were a few governors that asked Facebook to take down events related to those protests, and Facebook complied. And of course, there was a big hubbub about, First Amendment rights after that. And I think in this case, rightly so. Of course, yes, Facebook should be complying with these laws and stay-at-home orders. It is, a violation of not necessarily law, but the edicts that the governments have set forth, state governments have set forth, and the people who are breaking lockdown incur a fine in some cases, and certainly it's a threat to public safety. But the manner in which this happened, where the state government asked Facebook to take it down and they complied, and then after the fact, we're transparent about that, that's not really what we would want. Ideally, in a regulatory framework, we would want some sort of notice period, a adjudication to happen by a independent judicial body with the process of appeal to be possible. And that's not the framework that we're in right now. So I'm a little worried about that. But we're also seeing a lot of the good speech about coronavirus being kind of quashed in the algorithms because they don't have as many human content moderators working now because they've all had to go home rather than sit in the dungeons through which they were modifying content before. And they're relying on algorithmic intervention here. And that's kind of suppressing a lot of the good content and good conversation about the virus that we really need at this point. So we're not really, I wouldn't call this the golden age of content moderation and of social media regulation, but it shows what can be done when the platforms decide that it's worthwhile. And I do think it's interesting that, it took people dying for this to become something that they cared about. And there is an argument to be made that the electoral decisions we make have similar effects in other parts of our lives, but it's, a few steps removed. So how are they going to grapple with this when it comes to the political disinformation, especially in the United States, where coronavirus is going to be the election issue? How are we going to grapple with that as they continue to try to moderate this content? I'm not sure, and I am really worried about that. And one final note, we talked about this a little bit before in terms of encrypted messengers, but a lot of the disinformation is being spread in closed and private spaces online, whether that's in encrypted messengers or in groups. And Facebook in particular is doing a lot less moderation in those areas because they wanted to pivot to privacy after the 2016 election. Those are the terms that Zuckerberg used, and people, find these trusted communities there. That's where a lot of the health misinformation is spreading. So I worry a lot about that, and that's not getting hit by those content moderation algorithms.
So just to finish up, I'm going to ask one final question that again is two questions in one, but they are deeply related. You mentioned there, Nina, about the forthcoming elections in November. What kind of role are you expecting that disinformation and misinformation is going to be playing in that? Are there any kind of, I suppose, early trends that you can already spot in the kind of discourse around, say, the primaries on the Democratic side and the emergence of some kind of key narratives in any of the kind of groups and areas that you're keeping an eye on? And I think linked to this, I suppose there is this question about, we are becoming much more familiar with these techniques and tactics. They're almost feeling a little bit old hat now, the sort of practices that were involved in the 2016 election and so on. Are you starting to see an evolution in them? Is there a sense of a kind of fatigue or a familiarity or a lessening of their impact in some way? So how do you factor that into thinking about what might take place in the election as well?
Mm-hmm. So for the first question related to kind of the themes of disinformation that I expect to see, I think it's going to be a continuation of what we were seeing before. So around Super Tuesday in the United States, we had a lot of discussion of rigging of the election, and that was coming from both sides of the spectrum and kind of merges into this narrative about the deep state, which exists again on both sides of the political spectrum. I think we're going to see a lot more of that because it really does tie into everything that we've been dealing with coronavirus, with, you know, governments taking control and having these lockdowns and people pushing back against them. I think we're going to see a lot of that, and certainly, you know, there's going to be disinformation related to the candidates, et cetera, but it's all going to get back to people's relationship with their government. And in that regard, I think both parties need to offer some sort of alternative that is a compelling narrative about why they should be elected, which I think both of them have yet to really offer. We need a narrative that goes against the disinformers. And currently we're just trying to wade ourselves through this, you know, swamp of bad information and figuring out how this crisis is going to end. So we've not really thought proactively about that. So I worry about that. In terms of tactics, you know, there's been so much hubbub about deep fakes and all of these, you know, manipulated synthetic media. I really don't think that there is any reason for any disinformers to invest in something that is fancy, because the cheap fakes are still really working. The stuff that I saw being shared in these fringe groups in Massachusetts, for instance, was just, you know, dank memes, as the kids would say. It's people still like that stuff, and it's easy to share. It's easy to share from those groups, from WhatsApp messages, from closed and private groups, to download an image and then share it on your own timeline, which makes it more difficult to track. I mean, it's impactful because it's emotional and people are engaging with it. It doesn't need to necessarily be, you know, a manipulated video of Joe Biden saying or doing something he never did. Although people did freak out a whole bunch when Trump shared a video that was created with an app of Joe Biden like licking his face. So that's not a deep fake, that's still a cheap fake. And thankfully we're not in the era where true deep fakes have been democratized yet. But, you know, I think we're going to see a lot of the same tactics. I think that actually the awareness within the average population, that people who don't think about this every day, all day, is still pretty low. And they think that fake news is something that's completely fabricated and that they'd never fall for it. But actually, we know disinformation, again, traffics in that emotion, and there's a very low awareness of how that works and kind of the ecosystem through which it travels, from, you know, inauthentic accounts to the local populations that are being manipulated. So I think we have a lot of work to do there, and our elected officials need to be involved in educating people, and instead they're the ones that are creating and engaging in disinformation right now. So I am not very optimistic about our upcoming electoral contest, unfortunately.
Peter.
So look, tactics are always evolving. I think more importantly, as Nina says, the demand is still there. You know, people aren't just like, you know, fooled by disinformation. There is a demand. Propaganda only works if it goes with something that's already there, when it goes with the grain. Yeah, it releases something either horrible hiding within us, or or something less horrible that we desperately want satisfied. It's very hard to kind of reconvince someone or change someone's mind. You can do that over many years of kind of agenda setting and mainstream TV. But this kind of information operations, they work when they feed human psychology, and that human psychology is not advanced. However, the really shocking thing for me is, look, in 2016, we all became very aware that the internet is this sort of, through the way the internet's developed, especially social media, our information space, which should be the place of our public sphere, of open democratic debate, a place where maybe power is not equal. There are big media and small media, but at least we can make critical judgments, like we can in our usual media space, where we know that Murdoch controls half the media, and therefore we can kind of analyze what he's up to. We can make sense of it, and we can debate it and engage with it in a democratic way. The internet remains a black box. We have no idea about why algorithms show us one thing and not another. We have no idea about how our own data is used to target us. We don't really have an idea about why a political campaign shows us one ad and why it's showing somebody else another ad, or which ad it's showing them. There's some weak attempt to create ad libraries for political campaigns, but they're rubbish, yeah? we're still in a black box, and the detrimental effect of that on democracy is really, really hard to calculate because it's fundamental. So now you have the Trump campaign saying Google is pushing liberal news up, conservative news down, and we don't know. We have no way to judge that at all. It's crazy. The more you think about it, the crazier it is. And one of the most shocking things for me the last few years was the most basic law that was meant to pass in America, which was going to basically take the same rules you had for TV advertising and put them for online political ads, where you would know who was behind a political ad. You know, like on American TV, I'm Joe Biden and I endorse this message. You know, you would have had those kind of rules for ads on the internet. It's so basic. And His beguiling Highness Mitch McConnell blocked it. So we are still in a world where the whole internet is a black box, where it's closed, where its very model is disinforming, before we get to the disinformation campaigns. That's not great for democracy.
Well, we seem to have finished on a rather sober point here at the end, which I must promise.
Seriously, you would have thought for 4 years ago, everyone was like, oh, this is a problem, and nothing has happened. I was convinced we'd have regulation by now, that it just made things more transparent. Not even saying taking stuff down, which is controversial, just open it up. You know, just at least make the content moderation thing transparent. Just make the thing transparent so we can engage with it. No, I don't know. I'm actually just shocked how little we've progressed.
Well, I mean, you know, it's always strange finishing on a sort of downward note, but I think, you know, it probably does accurately reflect the nature of this situation, which is still complex and problematic. And as both of you have made the point incredibly persuasively, there's just still so much that we don't know. And so because the threat continues to evolve and we still are only, you know, 10 steps behind understanding what just happened to us 4 years ago, our readiness and our capacity to respond to future threats is always constrained. So we'll leave it there for today, but hopefully we can check in with you both further down the line as this landscape continues to progress and evolve. So for now, thank you very much to Nina and to Peter.
Thank you.
My pleasure. What are those pictures behind you, Sophie? I'm trying to work it out the whole time.
That's for another recording.
Okay. Is that Saudi Arabia?